Welcome to COVID-19 and the Law. This is a Tsai Talk series presented by the Tsai Center for Law Science and Innovation at the SMU Dedman School of Law. My name is David Taylor, and along with Keith Robinson, I serve as a co-director of the Tsai Center. This Tsai Talk series will explore legal issues surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. You can stay up to date on upcoming dates and topics in this series, as well as the Tsai Center's other activities, by following us on Twitter at SMU Tsai Center, that's TSAI, and look for our future emails. Today's first installment of our Tsai Talk series is entitled Law and the Search for a COVID-19 Vaccine. Today's speaker will be Nathan Cortez, the Adelpha Boteo Cabello Endowed Professor of Law in Leadership in Latino Studies at the SMU Dedman School of Law. Professor Cortez plans to discuss the international search for a COVID-19 vaccine, using the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's rules for drug development as a baseline. Also, how various FDA rules for expediting drug approval are being applied to accelerate the process, and how other government incentive programs also seek to speed the development of a vaccine. If time allows, he may also discuss various regulatory accommodations made to facilitate COVID diagnostic and antibody testing. Professor Cortez teaches and writes in the areas of health law, administrative law, and FDA law, and his research focuses on emerging markets in healthcare and biotechnology. He obtained his undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and his law degree from Stanford. After law school, he practiced with the Washington, D.C. law firm Arnold & Porter as part of its pharmaceutical, healthcare, and biotech practice. Since joining the law school, he has published numerous articles in leading academic and practitioner-oriented journals, including the Berkeley Technology Law Journal and the New England Journal of Medicine. Before Professor Cortez begins his presentation, let me cover two administrative points. First, I invite you to submit questions for Professor Cortez using the Q&A feature on your screen. Following his presentation, I'll moderate a question and answer session. Second, for the practicing attorneys joining us, we will provide CLE information on your screen at the end of today's session. And for those of you that are attending live today, we'll send an email following today's session. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Cortez.
Hi, everyone. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope you find this somewhat informative. So for those who don't know me, my work focuses on health law and regulation, particularly regulation of the biotech sector by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And I've been teaching a course on FDA regulation here at SMU for about 13 years now. And during that time, I've published a number of articles on FDA law. And in my food and drug course, we cover pharmaceutical R&D, and the FDA drug approval process, the different phases of clinical trials, and FDA regulation of manufacturing and marketing. And I also dedicate a few classes to device regulation and diagnostics and vaccine development. Relatedly, I also teach a course on comparative health law and bioethics, where I cover legal responses to pandemics and other infectious diseases around the world. So my goal today is to share what I know about the process, given now that we're all very interested in vaccine approvals. We just passed the milestone of 150,000 deaths in the United States, and that's only the official count. The unofficial number of deaths from COVID-19 is probably a fair bit higher. So we're all interested in vaccine development now, and I'm going to share what I know. So here's what I plan to cover over the next 30, 40 minutes. First, I'll discuss some of the current vaccine candidates in development and how they might work. Second, I'll explain the FDA approval process and all the ways that the FDA can expedite the approval process in light of the current pandemic, all the flexibilities and discretion FDA has. Third, I'll talk about Operation Warp Speed and what it means from a legal and regulatory standpoint. And finally, I'll discuss what I call vaccine exceptionalism. This is all the ways that the law treats vaccines differently from other pharmaceuticals and why this matters now. And I'll try to reserve 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. All right, so first, how many vaccine candidates do we have right now and how might they work? The New York Times has a helpful coronavirus vaccine tracker on its website. And currently it lists over 165 vaccine candidates in development around the world. As you can see here on the left, there are 140 or so vaccine candidates that have yet to start human trials. 18 of them have reached phase 1 human trials. 12 are in phase 2, 6 are in pivotal phase 3 trials, and 1 very narrow limited drug has been approved. So I'll explain what this means in a bit, but basically we have 27 vaccine candidates in human trials as of Wednesday, July 29th. There are a few different types of vaccines, as shown here on the right. We have whole virus vaccines, which use inactivated or weakened forms of the virus itself. And the purpose is to stimulate an immune response in the body. So when immune cells encounter them, they make antibodies. And this is how most vaccines work today, including our yearly flu vaccine. Then we have genetic vaccines, which don't deliver the entire inactivated virus to your body. Instead, they use engineered DNA or RNA to deliver genetic instructions for building viral proteins. And once your body detects these proteins from the virus, it triggers an immune response. It's worth noting that no one has yet created genetic vaccines for humans yet, and so this is experimental. Third, we have viral vector vaccines, which use a different virus, particularly an adenovirus. Some researchers in China are using a cold virus to deliver genes into cells to immunize people against coronavirus. And so the adenovirus, or the viral vector virus, is altered and it's missing one of its own genes, so it can't replicate and create the underlying virus itself. It's merely a vehicle for delivering signals or information that contain coronavirus genes. And so your body should recognize the foreign substance and start generating antibodies. Viral vector vaccines are pretty common. We have one for rabies and HIV and Ebola. And finally, we have protein-based vaccines, which uses a coronavirus protein or even a fragment of a protein to help teach the immune system how to identify proteins from the coronavirus. So currently our vaccines for HPV or shingles or hepatitis B use this protein-based idea. And so there are other variants, and there are even variants of variants, but these are the 4 major types of vaccines in development right now. So moving to slide 4, every week we're seeing headlines announcing that this or that vaccine has reached an important milestone in the drug development and drug approval process. So for example, this Wednesday, 2 companies announced that they were beginning pivotal phase 3 trials, Moderna and Pfizer. And so Moderna and the NIH began a trial on Monday of a genetic vaccine using mRNA, and they're going to try to enroll 30,000 people at around 90 sites around the US, and 15,000 will get 2 shots of the vaccine 28 days apart, and the other 15,000 in the control group will get shots of a saline solution as a placebo. And then they'll track the 30,000 people to see if a statistically significant number of vaccinated people either don't get COVID at all or get a milder form of the disease compared to people in the placebo or control group. And so they're measuring one, who actually gets COVID, 2, if more people die without the vaccine than the people that received it, and 3, if more people get severe cases of the disease rather than the people who received the vaccine. So earlier this month, Moderna announced a successful phase 1 trial published here on the right in the New England Journal of Medicine, which tested the vaccine on 45 healthy adults. And they found that it produced a pretty robust immune system response, generating antibodies from B cells as well as generating a T cell response. Now, this doesn't mean that it'll necessarily confer complete immunity on these people, which is why we need phase 2 and phase 3 trials. but it's promising in preliminary studies. And so the Moderna trial is enrolling people right now. They anticipate that enrollment will complete by the end of the summer with results hopefully by November. Also this week, Pfizer, in partnership with a German and a Chinese pharmaceutical company, started a phase 3 trial by enrolling people in the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Germany. And so they're also trying to enroll 30,000 healthy participants, and they anticipate that enrollment will take 2 months with results 4 to 6 months after that. And in this drug, early phase 1 trials showed that the vaccine did produce antibodies and a T-cell response. But again, we need phase 3 trials to determine if it actually confers some form of immunity. And the Pfizer drug has been in the news recently because the Trump administration awarded the companies a $1.9 billion contract to produce 100 million doses by December, hopefully, if the FDA approves it. Another promising candidate here on the bottom right of the screen is a vaccine being developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford University. And it's based on a chimpanzee adenovirus, and they just reported favorable phase 1/2 trial results here in the Lancet, as you can see on the bottom. And they're starting phase 3 trials in England, Brazil, and South Africa. And so one notable thing about the US trials is that the NIH and CDC are encouraging certain populations that have been particularly hard hit by coronavirus to enroll. So they're encouraging Blacks and Latinos and Native Americans and people with chronic health conditions to enroll in these trials to see if these vaccines are effective. Another note is that the scientists evaluating the coronavirus itself don't think that the coronavirus is likely to mutate enough to escape an effective vaccine. One reason is because the coronavirus has noticeable spike proteins on the surface, which should make it easier for the body to recognize. And so the more we dig into the virus, its genome was sequenced back in January, which predated the drug discovery process. But the more they study it, a few bright spots have emerged. And one is that it's unlikely to mutate enough to evade vaccines. And two is that the spike protein makes it highly identifiable by the body. So moving to slide 5, what law governs this process? So the US Food and Drug Administration has jurisdiction from Congress to approve new drugs and biologics, and this comes from 2 statutes, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act from 1938 and the Public Health Service Act. And the statutes give the agency really broad authority to approve new drugs, and the FDA spells out its expectations in detail in the Code of Federal Regulations and the Federal Register and in dozens and dozens of guidance documents on its website. The basic standard for approval from the statute is safe and effective. So in order for the FDA to approve a new drug, they have to find substantial evidence that a drug is safe and effective for its intended uses. And the FDA interprets this standard as requiring at least 2 double-blinded placebo-controlled trials. And again, a placebo is basically a saline solution, a sugar pill, or something that is meant to look like the drug being studied. And blinding is the process of not telling the recipients of the drug, the study subjects, the patients, whether they're getting the placebo or not. And double blinding means not even telling the physicians or health professionals administering the product who is getting the drug and who is getting the placebo. And so vaccines are a little different because they're some of the most effective drugs we've ever made. Vaccines have completely eradicated diseases like polio and measles, mumps, and rubella and the like. But what does effectiveness mean in this context? First, no vaccine is 100% effective in all people. And so it's a matter of percentages. What's the minimum amount we're willing to accept to determine that a drug is effective? Also, you have instances like the flu vaccine where its immunity only lasts a short time. We tend to get flu vaccines every year, or flu vaccine updates, because the flu vaccine doesn't last a long time. And so, like the flu vaccine, a coronavirus vaccine might prevent you from getting coronavirus, or it might cause a milder form of the disease, which would still be quite a victory. But even a vaccine that's only 50% effective, or rather 50 effective in preventing death in 50% of people otherwise, might be enough. And the FDA said it would approve a vaccine that protected at least 50% of the people that take it. But we still won't know whether the vaccine is effective until we test tens of thousands of people. And smaller studies with a few dozen or even a few hundred people aren't going to tell us in a scientifically rigorous way whether the vaccine is effective. And we won't know for months how long any immunity lasts. So again, with the flu vaccine, we have to get updates every year. How long will immunity from a COVID-19 vaccine last? And how much severe disease or death does it prevent? It just takes time to learn the answers to these questions. So here's a graphic showing you what the FDA approval process looks like. And there are several important milestones. We have on the far left the preclinical phase, and then we have the clinical trial phase in the middle with phases 1, 2, and 3. And then we have FDA review here in blue. So let me say a quick word about each. So the preclinical phase is all the way on the left. And the preclinical phase basically tests vaccine candidates and drugs in development through computer modeling and animal testing. For example, testing it on mice or monkeys that have a similar disease path as humans. And this is like a proof of concept stage where scientists want to see if the vaccine produces an immune response in animals or not. Once there's adequate preliminary data from computer modeling and animal testing, then the FDA approves human trials. So there are 3 phases of human trials, and this is like going from first base to second base to third base, and the goal is to get to home plate. So phase 1 trials are small and they're short. Typically, the vaccine is given to a small number of people, maybe a few dozen or so, to see if the drug is safe and to see if it stimulates an immune response, and to start exploring what dose is necessary. Phase 2 trials are bigger. We give the drug to hundreds of people, and we split those into distinct groups like children and the elderly to see if the vaccine acts differently in these populations. And we also start to get good data on what doses are effective and which ones cause safety problems. So it's a little bit like Goldilocks and the 3 bears. You don't want to give extreme high doses and cause more problems than you're trying to solve, but you need to give enough of the drug to ensure that it's activated. All right, then phase 3 trials are called the pivotal trials. These are placebo-controlled trials of tens of thousands of people, ideally, with the population split into a control group that receives a placebo and an active arm of the study that is randomly assigned to receive the drug being studied. So let me say a word about, so you have to proceed, you have to show data demonstrating safety and efficacy to graduate to each phase. So you have to have successful phase 1 to get to phase 2 and so on to phase 3. Ordinarily, this process can take several years, anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And I read recently that no vaccine has ever been developed in less than 5 years. But it takes months to know how long the vaccine confers immunity on those who take it, whether it's safe, if there are any longer term side effects or risks. And this is a process we really can't shortcut. We have to wait and see how the science plays out. And rushing it can be problematic. When we tried to rush a polio vaccine to market in 1955, a manufacturing error caused polio in about 70,000 children around the US. and it permanently crippled 164 children, and 10 of those children died. So this is something we just can't rush. We have to let the scientific process work itself out. Here's a slide I show to my students in food and drug law explaining how the different phases of clinical trials work. Again, this is just the typical process. You go from smaller, shorter phase 1 trials where you're getting preliminary data. Then you're building up towards a phase 2 trial where you're studying the drug in larger populations. And then phase 3 trials are really the pivotal trials where you're trying to get definitive evidence of safety and efficacy. You're studying the drug in preferably thousands of people. You're starting to really nail down the dosages, the best form, common side effects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all this process, as you can imagine, generates quite a bit of data. So here is a picture of an FDA reviewer sitting on a new drug approval application back in the 60s or 70s. And this is a single application submitted by a single drug company. So she's sitting on probably over 100 binders here. And so again, the NDA process, the new drug approval process, generates massive amounts of data. And these binders contain everything from clinical trial results and analyses and statistical analyses to manufacturing procedures and the like. So this is not a casual review. FDA reviewers face a ton of work in the coming months to review all the different candidates being developed. So ordinarily, moving to slide 9, this process can take a decade or more. And here's a chart showing what the typical vaccine development timeline looks like. And you can see beginning in 2020, you have academic research. It might take a few years. This is basic scientific research. Then you have preclinical testing and modeling and evaluation. Then the clinical trial phase might not start until years later. And that itself typically takes 3, 4, 5 years. And then you have to ramp up capacity to manufacture the drug in larger quantities. And so you have to build factories and manufacture and demonstrate to FDA that you can actually manufacture the drug safely and effectively. And manufacturing is actually the most frequent reason why a new drug approval is rejected by the FDA. It's because the company faces too many problems manufacturing the drug consistently and according to quality standards. And so, again, according to our historical experience with developing vaccines, it can take years or even decades. And so you're looking at a vaccine by November 2033. Going to slide 10, here's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to compress the process into 12 to 18 months. And you can see how quickly we're trying to achieve this. Everything is being compressed into a very short timeline. And we're trying to do something that's never been done before. Again, I just read yesterday that the shortest time frame we've ever developed a vaccine was 5 years. And so we're really trying to accomplish something that we haven't been able to accomplish before. Now, of course, speeding things up is not entirely new. For decades, the FDA has been expediting approval for important drugs for serious or life-threatening diseases like cancer, HIV/AIDS, and other conditions. And so these 4 programs are just the few major programs that FDA uses to try to speed up the approval process. So you have the Fast Track program, which the FDA uses to identify promising candidates to treat diseases for which there's no real effective treatment yet. And Fast Track allows the FDA to give candidates early feedback on their clinical trial design, and candidates can also submit a rolling NDA, which allows FDA to start its review before the entire application is finished. And so, for example, instead of submitting 100 binders of data all at once as part of your application, you might submit 4 or 5 binders at a time, and FDA reviewers can begin reviewing before the entire process is complete on the manufacturer's side. Second, we have a new breakthrough designation program that Congress created, and it allows FDA to identify particularly promising therapies for serious or life-threatening diseases, and the FDA will work with companies to streamline clinical trials and FDA review of the data. Then we have accelerated approval, which allows companies to streamline their clinical trials, typically by using surrogate endpoints. So instead of studying mortality or death, you're identifying surrogate endpoints such as tumor shrinkage or other things that correlate to good outcomes. And the company will accelerate the clinical trial process, but in exchange, they agree to continue studying the drug in post-marketing clinical trials after the drug's been approved. And then finally, we have priority review, which allows the FDA to prioritize certain new drug approval applications for immediate review. And so, again, all of these are ways that the FDA can speed up and expedite not only the clinical trial process, but also the FDA review of all this data. And the key point here legally is that the FDA has a lot of discretion and a lot of flexibilities under the statute. And the FDA is now using all of its flexibilities, all of its statutory authorities and flexibilities to speed up the process for reviewing and approving a COVID-19 vaccine. One new program is called CTAP. It's the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program. And the FDA is using this to work with companies to speed up clinical trials and FDA review, not only for vaccines, but for drugs that treat people with active COVID-19. And there's an NIH program created for the pandemic, where the NIH is working with the FDA and other agencies and industry to develop vaccines and treatments quickly. And so in addition to these 4 older programs, we have a number of new programs created to allow agencies to work much more closely with companies to develop vaccines quickly. I want to make a quick note about political pressure on the FDA. The FDA is a sub-agency of the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS is a cabinet agency, meaning President Trump nominates the HHS secretary and can fire the HHS secretary. And so there's a direct line of political pressure on HHS and the FDA. And under ordinary times, the FDA gets a lot of pressure to approve relatively ordinary drugs. There's pressure from industry, there's sometimes pressure from the administration. And when the FDA denies an application, it faces a lot of backlash. And so you can imagine the pressure that the FDA is going to be under now to approve new drugs quickly. And if there's any doubt between approving and not approving, there's going to be tremendous pressure on the FDA to approve it. So again, we want the FDA to move quickly, but we don't want them moving so quickly that they're approving vaccines that aren't safe or aren't effective or some combination of both. And so this is one thing to keep an eye on, and this has been a problem under the Trump administration, is kind of a battle between science and politics. And this tension is by no means novel to the Trump administration, but we have a president that's touting ineffective drugs like hydroxychloroquine for COVID. And so there's a real risk here that the Trump administration will put pressure on the FDA to approve a drug that the data don't support. So this is something to keep an eye on. The FDA is not immune from political pressures at all. And in my food and drug class, we talk about instances going over a few different decades of the FDA's scientific judgments being overridden by political appointees and political pressure. All right. So we also have Operation Warp Speed. So Operation Warp Speed is the administration's big program for accelerating vaccine development and diagnostic testing approvals and treatments for COVID. And this is a congressionally authorized $10 billion fund to help this public-private initiative whereby the federal government subsidizes pharmaceutical R&D and production and distribution of vaccines and diagnostic tests. So here's a video that I won't show of HHS Secretary Alex Azar explaining Operation Warp Speed. And the program involves 5 major agencies as well as a number of sub-agencies, including Department of Health and Human Services, the CDC, the FDA, the National Institutes of Health, and even the Department of Defense. And so the idea is to bring all hands on deck and to get the federal government cooperating, speaking to each other to really accelerate the entire process. Now, let's say the process is accelerated. I want to emphasize that not everyone is going to get a new vaccine right away. The first doses will likely go to healthcare workers and residents of nursing homes, and then essential workers like police officers, employees at food processing plants and the like. And only after these populations are covered would vaccines be available widely to the general public. And so we just don't know when that is. Hopefully sometime in 2021, but you have to temper your optimism when you read a headline. If you read a headline saying phase 3 trials showed this vaccine was highly effective, it doesn't mean that that vaccine is going to be available the following week or the following month. It's going to take a long time to manufacture, and then there's probably going to be a priority system. I want to close with a discussion on what I call vaccine exceptionalism. So everything I just described about expediting the process, it sounds pretty extraordinary, and indeed it is, but the law has long treated vaccines differently than other pharmaceuticals. And so this reflects what I teach my students is vaccine exceptionalism. These are the special rules and protections and subsidies and incentives that make vaccines widely available. And without these things, it's not clear that vaccines would be developed or distributed as widely as they are today. And so, for example, the government subsidizes vaccine R&D and distribution, and it provides significant financial incentives to manufacturers if those financial incentives are otherwise lacking. And so the government subsidizes not only primary scientific research, but also a lot of manufacturing and distribution efforts. And the economics of vaccines are interesting. I won't go into too many details, but vaccines aren't always huge moneymakers for companies. In the case of COVID, it might be a massive moneymaker given the amount of people that will be taking it. But we typically take a vaccine once or twice, and it's not like a cholesterol drug that you're taking every day. And so the quantity, we might be treating a lot of people, but people are typically only taking 1 or 2 doses. And so the government provides direct financial incentives to companies to invest in R&D and to invest in manufacturing to actually develop these drugs and to manufacture them. Vaccines also enjoy a mandate that most other drugs don't. So we have to be inoculated to attend school or to join the military or to work in hospitals or other healthcare settings. And these mandates are things that are completely foreign to other types of drugs. So when you talk about drug development, people don't have to take cholesterol drugs. They don't have to take medication for blood pressure and the like. But with vaccines, there are lots of mandates in federal, state, and local laws that you do. And so I want people to think about, or it's worth thinking about, what kind of mandates we'll see with the COVID vaccine. Are you going to be required to have a COVID vaccine to go back, to send your kids back to school? Are you going to be required to have a vaccine to attend university or to work in certain jobs? And so these legal issues will be on the horizon. Third, adjudication and liability is different for vaccines. So the government will adjudicate claims against manufacturers by providing special judicial forums for people injured. And there are special vaccine injury claims processes that are handled by the Court of Federal Claims. Again, if you get injured by another product and you want to bring a product liability lawsuit, you don't have a special court of federal claims to visit. You have to bring your claim in ordinary court. And so even with other pharmaceuticals, you're typically bringing a state law claim in civil court. You're not taking part in this unusual federal claims process. And so vaccines are different because we provide a unique forum for adjudicating claims. And finally, in some cases, the government assumes legal liability for any injuries caused by vaccines. So again, injuries from vaccines are not common, but again, we have yet to figure out what side effects COVID-19 vaccines might cause. We want people to get vaccinated. We don't want manufacturers getting sued and going out of business as a result, given the number of people involved. And so we usually have special injury compensation programs and no-fault injury compensation schemes. So one big example is the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, which automatically compensates children who develop certain well-known types of side effects and symptoms after taking certain vaccines. And instead of making them go through the litigation process, they get automatically compensated by the government, and vaccine manufacturers are immune from liability. We went through a recent round of this with the Safety Act passed after 9/11, which created legal immunities for companies developing anti-terrorism products. And so companies developing products to treat or prevent anthrax, bioterrorist agents, and the like were given legal immunity from product liability suits in order to provide sufficient incentives for companies to manufacture and distribute those vaccines. And I imagine we'll see some similar mix of exceptionalism for the COVID-19 vaccine. In fact, there might be a range of things that go well beyond the different programs you see here on the slide. With that, we have plenty of time for questions, I believe. And I put up here an image of a book I just published on comparative health law and bioethics. We have a large section dealing with infectious diseases, and we evaluate how countries around the world with very different legal systems and very different public health systems try to handle pandemics and other infectious diseases. So with that, I will allow my colleague, Professor Taylor, to help moderate the questions.
Sure, thanks, Professor Cortez. And I want to encourage everybody, again, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature there on your screen. I encourage you to do that. And as we're waiting for questions to roll in, hopefully they do, I just wanted to ask you, you've been studying, I mean, this is your area of the law, so the pandemic has recently arisen, but you've been studying this area of the law for years, you practiced in this area. So my question is, has the pandemic indicated, have there been longstanding problems with respect to the statute or the regulations that the FDA uses to approve drugs that the pandemic has highlighted that need to be fixed or clarified?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a complicated one. One problem you typically hear from the drug industry is that the statute isn't specific enough, and that the FDA has too much discretion. It has too much leeway to use its judgment, and that it abuses this discretion with the regulations it promulgates and the enforcement actions it brings. But here, I think you're seeing exactly why agencies like the FDA need that flexibility. If the statute is too prescriptive, if it's too specific and speaks in narrow terms, then the FDA might have to go beyond its statutory authority to be flexible and to be nimble in situations like this. And that's been a common theme in my food and drug law class. We begin by talking about how broad the statute is and the relatively limited role for judicial review for courts to second guess the expert scientific judgments of the FDA. Of course, that hasn't stopped litigation against the FDA. and we spend the whole semester reading those cases. But I think it's important that, you know, the Food and Drug statute, the major statute the FDA uses here, dates back to 1938, and it's been amended over 100 times. And that 1938 statute was itself based on the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. And so we've had a lot of time to try to get it right. The FDA is often criticized for having too broad of authority, too much discretion, but we're seeing the benefits of that now. And that allows the FDA to be more nimble, to be more flexible than it otherwise would be. I'm sure there are specific instances of the statute being outdated or the FDA taking liberties up with it. But in a public health crisis, it's important that public health authorities have that discretion and that they're guided, that they're allowed to exercise their best judgments. And judicial review should be reserved for, you know, abuse of that judgment, abuse of discretion. And again, Congress has been active, and Congress typically amends the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act every 2 to 3 years, and it continues to tinker with these programs. But a lot of these programs give a lot of discretion to the FDA, and I think we're seeing the benefits of that.
Great. So we have a question from one of our audience. If a successful vaccine is developed outside of the United States, what would be the process for its approval and use in the United States?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one thing that the FDA and its sister agencies around the world are doing is they're coordinating. They've been very purposeful in coordinating their approval standards during the pandemic and clinical trial expectations, so that if a drug is approved in certain jurisdictions, the FDA can approve it in the United States based on those clinical trials, so that companies don't have to conduct a separate set of clinical trials that meet US standards. And this has been a long-term trend in drug development. You've seen councils of regulators around the world to get together to try to standardize their expectations for clinical trials and the drug approval process, so that a manufacturer in Europe that develops a drug can use the data and the clinical trial results to get it approved in the United States. So we are seeing quite a bit of coordination among regulators. That coordination is not a new thing. It's been happening for decades, but we're seeing accelerated and, again, more intentional coordination right now, given the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I mentioned before, the AstraZeneca and Oxford drug being developed is starting phase 3 trials in a number of jurisdictions. If those trials are successful, the FDA is not going to object that they were conducted overseas. The vast majority of drugs that we use in the US are approved based on studies conducted elsewhere. And so we have truly multinational pharmaceutical companies that have been doing truly multinational clinical trials for many, many decades now. And again, that infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure, is in place to allow pretty seamless approval between jurisdictions. Of course, there are some jurisdictions that don't get the kind of deference that others do from the US. You know, if the European Union approves something, it's likely to be viewed favorably in the US. But if it comes from a regulator that the FDA doesn't view has sufficient capacity, the agency is likely to be a little more searching in its review.
Great. Next question from someone in our audience. Are participants typically paid for being part of human trials?
They can be. Frequently, participants will either be compensated a pretty modest amount, or they'll have treatments and tests covered. So if a company wants to enroll 1,000 patients, usually they'll pay for the drug itself, as well as any tests conducted as a result of them participating in the trial. The compensation is usually pretty modest. And again, this is one reason why a lot of clinical trials have moved overseas to developing countries, because they're much cheaper to operate in low income and developing countries. And it just costs more to do trials in the US and Europe and other wealthy countries. So there is a compensation element. We're trying to study these in the United States, but undoubtedly you'll see clinical trials in almost every jurisdiction.
Great. Another question from our audience. Is the no-fault injury compensation framework able to handle a large influx of claims that may result from adverse side effects of an expedited vaccine?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, they handle a relatively modest number of claims now. I don't know how frequently cases come up in the Court of Federal Claims, but my sense is that if there were a vaccine approved that caused a wide number of side effects or problems, that it might quickly flood the Court of Federal Claims. I'm not sure they're equipped to handle that. And you might see congressional intervention at that point. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some sort of statutory preclusion of claims before that even came to pass. I think both the federal government and manufacturers and the rest of us in particular have an interest in getting the vaccine widely distributed. It may turn out to affect certain subsets of the population. God forbid a vaccine is particularly dangerous in children or particularly dangerous in the elderly. If that's the case, you might see the FDA limiting its indications and recommending other types of vaccines in those populations. So I think what we'll see is a variety of vaccines that are vying to be the primary one. And it might turn out that these vaccines, some vaccines are more effective in certain populations rather than others. But again, it's just going to take time to figure that out.
I have a follow-up question related to kind of international component here. What impact, if any, will our country's withdrawal from the WHO, what will that mean for access to a vaccine if it's developed outside the United States?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if the US finalizes its withdrawal from the WHO, I'm not sure it would have any direct effects on vaccine access in the United States. One problem, it might not be a problem for the US, but it'll be a problem for a lot of countries, is that the countries able to afford the vaccine will get it. And so the wealthier countries like the United States will be able to buy lots of doses, and the resource poor countries won't. And so the WHO is already considering ways that it can equalize distribution of these vaccines. And this came to light actually during Ebola in 2014, where Ebola treatments and vaccines were being developed, but they had such limited quantities. And some people objected to a handful of Americans getting doses while thousands of people continued to be affected in Africa. And so, the distributive problems and the ethics of it are going to be very, very tricky. I don't think the WHO is going to be a barrier to the US accessing it because we have money to buy a vaccine. I think the WHO could play an important role in helping ensure that vaccine distribution is more equitable.
Okay, I have two related questions to vaccines being mandated. So let me ask both of the questions. So first, if a successful vaccine were developed, would a mandate be enforced by the federal government or state governments? Do you suspect that there would be issues related to enforcement, given potential exceptions like religious liberty? And then the related question, in the past, there's a comment, I guess, before the question, how easy has it been to be exempted from a mandate requiring a vaccine? And are parental rights an issue?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and I'm afraid I don't have a really great answer. My answer is it depends on who is imposing the mandate. So if you can't join the military unless you're vaccinated, then the military controls that process. If you can't attend a local public school, then that is a process controlled by state law. And we saw a flood of state law exemptions, religious and otherwise, for vaccines. And those, were responsible for outbreaks of measles and all these long gone diseases in places like California and the like. And so some state legislatures actually started rescinding those exceptions. I'm not sure how carefully they were policed. I think in many instances, if you claimed an exemption, you were granted one. But we're realizing now that you need a pretty good reason for opting out of, you should have a pretty good reason if you want to opt out of a vaccine. And so, and I imagine there will be some enforcement federally if the federal government is requiring vaccines, for example, for contracting purposes, for employment purposes. I imagine there will be state litigation to the extent that state and local authorities are requiring vaccines for local hospitals and schools. You might also have ADA issues. People with disabilities might bring a claim under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the employer would have to try to come up with a reasonable accommodation if one was available for that employee. So there's, the vaccine issue is going to trigger lots of employment law issues, lots of labor issues. It's not at all limited to the FDA territory that I covered today.
So I have a question here. It relates to the intersection between what the government can do with respect to the vaccine and what the private sector is doing and can do. And so, for example, when a vaccine is developed, the FDA might approve it, but then how does it get released? And in particular, does the FDA or the government have a role to ensure that there's not a shortage? I think you mentioned there's some funding going on, but is there any role for the government beyond just funding private investors or manufacturing facilities?
Yeah, so there's a rule that applies to most pharmaceuticals and most drugs, and there's a different rule that applies to vaccines, or a different answer that applies to vaccines, and I think yet even a different answer that applies to COVID vaccines. So normally the government approves a drug, and it's up to the manufacturer to make it and to distribute it. For certain important drugs, the government will take a more active role in facilitating manufacturing and distribution. For vaccines, you typically do see some public-private cooperation. But for the COVID vaccine, you're seeing even more extraordinary public-private cooperation. And one fascinating thing now, I think I showed how compressed, if I could go back a few slides, I showed you how compressed the process, how compressed we're trying to make it. You see down towards the middle of the slide, the building factories block. You have a lot of companies building factories before products have been approved. And again, those are based on guarantees and subsidies and incentives by the federal government. So you're seeing a much more active role for the federal government beyond just approving the drug and then letting the private sector figure out manufacturing and distribution. You're seeing a truly remarkable coordination between the public-private sectors. And I think that's something that our system is designed to accommodate, again, by statute and regulation. And that's something that we should be particularly proud of right now.
All right, I have a question. I promise I did not prompt this question. It's not my own because it relates to patent law, but the question relates to, does the potential vaccine, may it be subject to patent law and therefore a company, I'm going to add a little context to the question, a company controlling the price of the drug, or are there current statutes in place or is there pending legislation that you know of that would impact the pricing mechanism that would be built into a distribution of the vaccine?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so patent-wise, I'll defer to David on this, but my sense is that a private company that patents a new chemical compound, a new chemical entity, will enjoy the patent on it, but you'll see significant licensing with the federal government. Internationally, there's going to be a fascinating legal question. I'm curious what you think on this, David, is that you have compulsory licensing under the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So a country that's desperate for a vaccine, could they use compulsory licensing to get domestic manufacturers? Like, Could India, which has tons of generic drug manufacturers, declare an emergency and say, we're going to compulsory license this drug and basically make it ourselves? I'm curious what you think about that, David.
Yeah, one of the requirements for that opportunity, particularly used in developing countries, is for the drug not to be in the market in that country. So if the patent owner makes the drug and makes it available in that country, arguably under current law, they wouldn't have the ability to use those rights to use compulsory licensing. And we really have not seen that before, but in this era of COVID, right, we're seeing things we haven't seen before. So it does seem to me more than a theoretical possibility that that could take place. It's certainly allowed under the law. We call it margin rights is one way to describe it.
Right. On the pricing issue, that's going to be complex as well. You know, with non-vaccine drugs, you already have pretty forceful arguments that NIH funds and National Science Foundation funds and basically public financing help generate a lot of the science and research that develops drugs. And so there are arguments that the government should be a lot more aggressive about demanding lower prices when the public subsidizes a lot of this research. I think you're going to see that argument made even more forcefully for COVID-19 vaccines, because the federal government is funding a lot of this research and throwing a lot of money behind this. And so I think there's a much more convincing case for special prices. At the same time, we want to pay enough to sustain manufacturing and to make it worth companies' while. And the question is, you know, what's a fair price? And you'll see lots of different buyers. You're going to see Medicare, Medicaid programs as purchasers. You're going to have pharmacy benefit managers on behalf of private insurance companies. You're going to have school districts, state and local authorities, the federal government itself. There are going to be so many purchasers lined up. The pricing, who gets the best pricing and under what terms is going to be a massive question. And I just don't know yet.
All right. One more question. You mentioned potential political pressure with respect to the vaccine and its development and selection to the extent the government has a role in that. So the question relates to what defenses to that pressure are available to civil servants and political appointees at the FDA or elsewhere? And what are the so-called canaries in the coal mine that we should be watching out for as indicators that potentially there's improper pressure being applied?
Right. So I think in normal drug development, you don't have nearly as much public interest in interim milestones like phase 1 results, phase 2 results. Now, for certain types of drugs, particularly cancer drugs, you have investors and patient communities that track results pretty closely. But still, there's a fair amount of data and information that isn't made public. The raw data from clinical trials are typically not made public. And I actually published a paper engaging with a proposal to make this information more transparent and to make the FDA's interim decisions and communications with companies more transparent. But there's going to be a lot of interest in tracking the milestones of these drugs. And the hope and the way it should work is that these studies will be peer reviewed and the data will be made available and subject to public scrutiny. And so hopefully, so again, on this slide 4 here, I have 2 original articles published. This is New England Journal on the top and the Lancet on the bottom. Now, these were published peer-reviewed studies in 2 of our very best medical journals, and rigorous scientific review hopefully will accompany decisions that the FDA makes. But you're already seeing the tendency of politicians to exaggerate clinical studies. The case of remdesivir, and in the case of hydrochloroquine, you saw politicians taking pretty tepid, weak data and blowing it up and running with it and characterizing it as much more effective and promising than it really was. And so, you know, science is hard to translate to the public to begin with. Headlines are often misleading. They often promise a lot more than what's the case if you dig behind it. Hopefully, the more public these studies are, the more public the data and the scientific discussion is, the less opportunity there will be for political influence on FDA decision making. But it's not going to be perfect. And I think we have to be particularly wary of HHS and political appointees leaning on FDA to make a favorable judgment on a drug with kind of data that's not entirely clear. And so, again, we see this political pressure during normal times. We see the FDA succumbing to political pressure when we're not talking about vaccines for an unprecedented pandemic. And so, it's something we have to be wary of. There are always cases of whistleblowers within the agency blowing the whistle. There's actually an interesting statute that I've written about a little bit that prevents the federal government from silencing federal employees on scientific matters. And so it's a science-based statute, and it's kind of meant to address a lot of the politics of environmental science, but it can also be used in the FDA context. If there's a whistleblower at the FDA that thinks something is fishy, they might rely on statutes like this. Now, there aren't a lot of judicial protections for these people, but we do have whistleblower statutes. There are some statutory frameworks in place to protect the federal whistleblower if they think something is fishy, but it's imperfect.
All right, with that, let me thank Professor Cortez for his presentation today. Thank you, our audience, particularly for the questions. They were very good. Professor Cortez is going to put up on the screen the CLE information for today's presentation. The course number is right there. It's 174093974. And as I mentioned, for those attending live today, this information will be emailed to you. We look forward to you joining future installments of our COVID-19 in the Law TIE Talk series. We anticipate our next installment will be on Thursday, September 3rd. Details will follow on Twitter at SMU TIE Center and by email. Until then, take care.